I gotta admit, I be getting hyped watching these videos. I just feel like I have a lot to say here. This is the Infographics show's take on who would win a war between the USA versus BRICS.
The United States is under siege. Troops pour in through Alaska, relentless and unyielding. The Pacific and Atlantic Oceans have become battlegrounds, with warships clashing in brutal naval combat.
I just want to say there's way too many Americans out there that think that we can fight literally the entire world. I think that obviously the U.S. does spend a ton on their military. We spend more on our military than the next top 10 nations combined. But that doesn't necessarily account for, there's a lot of other statistics that go into that, go into like the brutality of the war. Are we trying to attack all the other nations? Are we just defending? There's a lot that goes into just military spending. I mean, look at Russia versus Ukraine. Look how much more Russia spends on their military versus Ukraine. That's not always been the case. You know, spending itself is not the way you win wars. Look at the US versus Vietnam, or even anyone versus Afghanistan. But let's get into this.
A land invasion surges up from South America. The enemy is not just one nation,
From
it's all
South
five of the
America.
original BRICS powers.
Okay.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Okay, so it looks like we are not going to include the expanded countries into BRICS like I just showed. I mean, I don't know how much more this would have, you know, how much more of a difference that side would have gotten with those additional countries. I think just this alone would be very difficult to do.
Africa. The U.S. is at war with all five of the original BRICS nations. But in this ultimate showdown, who will emerge victorious? We uncover the answer in today's episode of the Infographic show,
Premium
USA versus BRICS. Who would win?
Bitrate.
But first, why are these nations fighting in the first place?
Okay, well, first of all, this needs to be said. BRICS is not a military alliance. It's an economic cooperation. I mean, they're kind of just trying to, they're trying to not have the US dollar be the number one, like, kind of de facto world currency. So these countries have very, first of all, China and India, like, those countries are not necessarily aligned. Even China and Russia, which a lot of people like to put as allies, they also have kind of, their interests kind of go against one another. It's hard for even those two countries to get along in certain instances. So this is not necessarily a guaranteed case that all five of these nations would want to fight a war together, let alone against the USA.
BRICS exists to mount a challenge against the existing Western-led world order. The U.S. spearheads that world order, which the BRICS nations believe is unfair and exploitative.
Yeah, I just reviewed a video about the United Nations, and you know, a lot of the reason that BRICS came together is for the dominance that the Western world order has over the United Nations. But more than just that, I just talked about currency and stuff like that.
But that alone wasn't enough to trigger a war. All five of the BRICS nations benefit from America being the world's power player.
Yeah,
for instance,
that's what I was
trade
gonna
between
say.
the U.S. and China reached an estimated $582.4 billion in 2024.
India's got the same economic interest to not go to war with the USA. We'd have to really make those countries mad, which, you know, one could argue that we are on the way to doing that, but
Trade with India, though not as lucrative, was still strong.
Yeah, there it is, India.
$129.2 billion exchange.
Quite the big difference, but everyone has their eye on India as being the future. A lot of companies, American companies, are moving production over to India, so that's definitely going to grow.
Exchanged hands between the two nations. So trade isn't at the heart of the war. Russia and China are the aggressors. Stung by U.S. sanctions and determined to break free from American dominance, they rally the rest of the BRICS nations to take a stand.
I don't think it really matters. I like that we're talking about how exactly this scenario could play out. I'm just interested in, like, basically their analysis of how the war would go, because that's a lot more fascinating to me.
The U.S. can cripple Russia and China's economies. What's to stop it from doing that?
I like that they have them in like a literal zoo right here. There's like an elephant in the background. First of all, Infographic show, bro, that's crazy. Like, like it's like China and Russia are animals here, but okay.
Same to Brazil, India, or South Africa. Fearing they could be next, BRICS unites under a single goal: to bring down the United States and establish a new BRICS.
Interesting metaphor there that the USA is basically just a scarecrow at this point. Maybe in certain aspects. I could definitely see in certain aspects, but maybe not necessarily in the military. Could be. We don't know.
Be next. BRICS unites under a single goal: to bring down the United
I don't think it's a scarecrow. Maybe just like a target practice thing.
States and
maybe
establish a new BRICS
training over there. Now it's time for the real thing. All right. So these are the five nations right here. This is the Chinese leader. This is India's leader. This is South Africa's leader. This is Oh, this is Brazil. This is Russia.
Sort of.
Okay.
But before it can do that,
I like how they're all identifiable. That's pretty good stuff.
it has to defeat the U.S. It's a fight for America's survival that starts with the manpower that all 6 nations bring to the table in mounting its defense.
6. Okay, yes, because we're including the USA. That was the first thing I was literally about to get into. Manpower, population, India, 1.4 billion. Oh my God. Ireland is collapsing off of my shoulder right now. He just fell on the floor, so he doesn't want to be a part of this conversation. By the way, you can go to makeshift.com right now, using that first link down below. If you'd like to get a hold of him, he's on the ground right now, but you're not going to be able to see him. But anyways, manpower, India, 1.4 billion population. You got China, who's supposedly about 1.4 billion. It actually might be a little bit less than that because they might be overestimating their population. South Africa, Russia, they're not going to be able to, or they're not going to contribute quite as much. Brazil is at like 225 or somewhere around their population. USA is only at 333, 335, somewhere around there. So we're going to be outnumbered like 6-1, 7-1, 8-1. Obviously, numbers is not all what it's about. And again, is this a defensive war? We need to see what they're going to talk about. Is this a defensive war? Are we just trying to protect our own shores? Because that's a huge bonus the USA will have if the BRICS nations have to come invade North America.
Defense, the U.S. has an impressive number of active and reserve troops available to call on. The country's military has 1.3 million active personnel, according to military aggregator Global Firepower. It also has...
Yeah, that's why I use Global Firepower as well. But yeah, so reserves, active, and yeah, these are all important to keep note of.
3 million active personnel,
Who is
troops available to call on. The country's
USA.
military has 1.3 million active personnel, according to military aggregator Global Firepower. It also has almost
China's got like 2
800,000
million.
reserves to help defend the nation. And it doesn't end there. The U.S. has one of the most well-armed citizenships in the entire world.
Very true. Okay, so we are going to be fighting a defensive war against BRICS. Now, that does make this conversation really interesting, and I'd love to see what you guys have to say in the comment section down below. Because, okay, that does kind of make it a lot easier. If the USA had to literally invade all 5 BRICS nations, no way. There's just no way. It's going to be way too messy. Don't forget the Navy. We probably will talk about U.S. Navy dominance. Obviously, China is really, starting to try to compete against that. Just having Navy dominance is not enough. I mean, look at World War II with the Germans like terrorizing the seas with their U-boats. There's certain ways that you can terrorize the #1 Navy in the world because, like we said, we just kind of saw that in World War II.
It's
Pretty
estimated
soon my
that
gun
there are
collection's
around
gonna outgrow my baseball
398
card
million
collection.
firearms in possession in a country that contains around 260 million adults.
True.
That amounts to more than 1.5 guns per American adult.
Oh, yeah.
Granted, only
There's a lot here.
41% of Americans say they'd be willing to fight for their country if they got wrapped up in a war, but
The numbers are going to be way lower than if it were to actually happen. If there were actual Brazilian troops invading Florida right now, that 41% is probably going to jump up to, I don't know. I mean, as soon as a country's sovereignty is threatened, everyone becomes prideful. Everyone becomes more nationalistic. Look at Canada. Canada being threatened to become annexed to be the 51st state. Everyone's like, oh, hell no, oh, hell no. When, if you asked them that 5 years ago, I don't know if nationalism in Canada would be quite as high. So, yeah, once the actual scenario is put in front of Americans, I think that number jumps to 80 or something, 80% or higher.
that's still a potential civilian army of 106.6 million.
Jeez.
However, that civilian army would be untrained and would likely
True.
cause more problems than they could solve if the BRICS nations invaded.
True. It would only be interesting if the BRICS nations were overwhelming the U.S. military. Then the American civilian population could cause a lot of chaos. Obviously, they'd have to fight completely guerrilla fighting. It would be a mess.
There's another challenge for the U.S. to confront on the manpower front. Not all of its soldiers are stationed in the U.S.
35,000 are stationed in Germany. I think around that number is stationed in Japan. So yeah, you'd have to pull those guys back, and you might not be able to do that, especially if the U.S. they don't even need to lose naval dominance. They just have to be terrorized in the seas, which they probably will. They might lose naval dominance. I'm not 100%. I think China alone could make the U.S. Navy struggle a bit, but then you contribute, India, Russia, Brazil, South Africa. They're not going to have a whole lot to contribute to the naval conversation. The U.S. is probably still going to have the most. You just have to bug them, though. You just have to bug them enough.
America maintains around 750 military bases in more than 80 countries,
Yes.
which gives it a massive global reach. That reach will help America in the naval battle against BRICS, as we'll explore later, but it also means America has fewer soldiers stationed on domestic soil than it might like. As of September 2023, the U.S. had around 228,000 military personnel stationed overseas, 168,000 of whom were active duty soldiers. The rest were reserves and civilian personnel working with the Department of Defense.
Yeah, they're not just in Germany and Japan, they're scattered all around the world, so you'd have to find a way to get all of those back, unless you wanted to launch like offensive invasions on India, China, Russia. I mean, a lot of the U.S. soldiers stationed in Europe is literally, to potentially fight Russia. So maybe you could launch little, skirmishes inside of Russian territory like the Ukrainians kind of did in Kyiv recently. Not in Kyiv, in Kursk, my bad.
Missed in the defense of the U.S. from BRICS? Possibly. On a pure manpower front, the combined BRICS nations easily beat the U.S. China alone brings 2 million active military personnel, along with over 510,000 reserves to the fight. Russia adds...
With China's manpower and Russia's military spending, their equipment, their tanks, those two alone would be very threatening. That would be very scary because the Russians still have that Soviet infrastructure. They invest a lot of their economy just purely into the military. So those two combined would be a scary kind of potential combo.
An army of
then you add India
million with 2 million reserves, with India bringing 1.4 million active fighters.
And to mention, all three of these nations border each other. Well, India and Russia don't border each other, but they're all connected border-wise. So if they started working together, they'd have, direct access to start working and coordinating inside. Brazil would kind of be the island by themselves. I mean, at least South Africa's not that far away from India. They kind of are, but Brazil's kind of on an island to themselves. We could probably immediately navally blockade Brazil and make sure that they don't reinforce the... We could maybe knock out Brazil. Maybe. I mean, I'm not trying to say we could invade Brazil because, man, they'd have a lot of people rising up in Brazil. I've seen a lot of crazy Brazilian videos of some violence that goes down there. So I don't think we should invade Brazil, but just kind of navally blockading them so that the Brazilians can't bring in reinforcements and help out China to coordinate attacks and things like that.
And over 1 million reserve personnel. Those three nations make up the rest of the top spots in global firepower rankings. They just won't stop coming behind the United States, and they are a combined force.
It will have to be Spartan. But here's the thing. North America, the geography of it, the way this World War III is going to play out, there is kind of a Thermopylae situation that could happen because, I mean, not exactly. Thermopylae was like a very tight area. But yeah, I mean, we're on a kind of a globe by ourselves over here, just in this continent. So you could maybe say it could be like a 300 moment.
To be reckoned with.
300, instead of 300 Spartans, it's just 333 million Americans. But
don't discount South Africa and Brazil. South Africa has a military of just over 71,000 active personnel and nearly 30,000 reserves. As for Brazil, which presents the most immediate on-land threat to the U.S., it has an army.
It presents the most immediate on-land threat, but yeah, I don't know if they're really going to be able to do that much.
Of 360,000 active personnel.
I mean, they're still pretty far away from... It would be very interesting to see because obviously the BRICS nations would probably try to stop a potential naval blockade of the Brazilian coastline that the Americans do. It would really depend on that. If the U.S. is successful in blockading the Brazilians, then they're pretty much knocked out of the war. They're not going to be able to do, I think, quite as much.
Personnel and around 1.3 million reserves. That gives BRICS 5.2 million active military personnel with around 4.8 million reserves. Assuming all reserves are called into action on both sides, that stacks America's 2.1 million reserve and present military personnel against an overwhelming BRICS force of over 10 million.
That is really not looking good. That is not looking good, but let's see how the scenario continues to play out. It's not all about manpower, but that's a pretty big factor. They're also not just, they don't just have manpower, but they do have the economies to back it. The Russian military, like I said, economically, they really like to invest in the military. And then China, the world's second biggest economy in the world.
It's not looking good for the United States on the manpower front.
Yes.
However, BRICS faces the problem of actually getting its people to the U.S.
Yes.
Russia attempts to filter in troops via the Bering Strait, which separates Russia from the United States by just 53 miles at its narrowest point. But those...
Yeah, this is going to be tough. We'll get into it. But, I mean, first of all, no one really lives in that area of Russia. No one really lives in that area of Alaska. Watch out for the polar bears up there too, but I don't know if it'd be a big deal if we lost Alaska. Even if you granted, just take it all over. Okay, we lost Alaska. We would lose a lot of potential oil, so that's something to keep in mind. I hope we do get into that, the oil talks, because that's a big deal. The U.S. does get a lot of oil here alone, but we'll see.
Those efforts are slow going and constantly impeded by a powerful U.S. Navy. Even the Russians who make it past the strait have to navigate Alaska and a part of Canada to get into the northern U.S. There is a more direct threat to America's south. Brazil is the only...
I can already feel like I'm gonna have a very unpopular answer. If this video is gonna go the way I think it's gonna go, I think I'm gonna have a very unpopular answer by the end of this video. But let's see.
BRICS nation that has a direct land connection to the United States, albeit one that runs through Mexico, and it's possible that BRICS could get Mexico on its side if it invades the U.S. After all, the U.S. administration proposed 25% tariffs on Mexico, and an executive order to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America have already created a contentious relationship.
If we're talking about introducing other countries on the world stage into this war, well, then it's going to be tough. I mean, obviously, granted, the USA has pissed off a lot of people recently, so maybe the US wouldn't get any more allies. But if BRICS brings in more allies to their side, okay, it's looking really bad. Maybe they could. I think they would have to do this. I think. We'll see where this video goes, but if BRICS pulls in Mexico, then I will be like seriously considering, okay, BRICS has a very, very real chance of completely invading and maybe successfully occupying the U.S. for a little bit there. I don't know how much the American people would like. I mean, we're a very armed population. It'd be chaotic. It'd be very chaotic. They'd probably be able to occupy us for years and years. We would make it a mess for them. I'm thinking Afghanistan, you know, the U.S. occupation over Afghanistan was not fun, not easy.
Should Mexico say yes to Brazilian troops streaming through its country into the U.S., that would force America to face an active Brazilian force of 360,000 on land. But
that's a fun scenario. Is that where we're going to go with this? Are we going to allow Mexico to help out BRICS? This is not the first time. Obviously, powers that have tried to fight the USA have pulled Mexico in or asked Mexico to join. Look at the Zimmerman letter of World War I. So that wouldn't be surprising. Mexico tends to like to be diplomatically very neutral. They like to just play... They like to play the field because they don't want to piss off the USA, but they're also willing to take investments from other countries like China or Russia. But they're number one. They do not want to make the U.S. mad. So let's see.
Assumes Mexico is on board with the plan. If it doesn't, Brazil would be forced to invade via the Gulf of America and the Gulf of California, neither of which are attractive options. It would be forced to navigate through America's Navy, which is...
Getting through their Navy is like swimming in a tank of sharks. I don't see how you do this. I really don't know. I mean, the biggest amphibious invasion, D-Day, you'd have to do that, but probably times 5? Is that a crazy number? And think about it, like the coordination from, Britain to France, it was only a couple miles across the English Channel. Brazil is hundreds of miles. Oh my gosh, that's difficult to think of.
A major hurdle, as we'll soon explain.
They'd have to get Mexico on their side or Canada. You got to be able to land somewhere there, but then the Navy would.
Plus, if Brazilian troops land in Texas, they'll face over 108,000 active soldiers stationed there. Landing in California is even worse. There are more than 156,000 active service members.
Yeah, since World War II, we've really built out the military in California, so we've got pretty good amount of things stationed here. Are we going to talk about nukes? I hope we just kind of leave the nuke question out of it because that makes this a lot less fun, a lot less like theoretical. There's a lot less to theorize when it comes to nukes. But tactical nukes, there's so many ways to approach this question. I mean, it's a 26-minute video, so maybe we will approach the question in a lot of different ways. I'd like to go at it from a scenario first of like no nukes, then maybe tactical nukes. If we just use nukes all outright, well, then the whole world's just screwed, basically.
Located in the state. Combine the two, and you get around 264,000 American troops. That's not quite enough to match Brazil's incoming force. But the U.S. can use its Navy to bottleneck the arrival of Brazil's troops to gain an advantage. Throw the 43,000 troops stationed in Hawaii into the mix, and the U.S. can almost match Brazil on the manpower front.
I think it depends on where we have a lot of our fleet stationed. I mean, obviously it's a fleet, it moves around, but at the time of the invasion, do we have more of the fleet in the Pacific or the Atlantic? That's going to be a really big factor. I think Hawaii could be screwed. I think BRICS could definitely take Hawaii if they catch us with our pants down.
As for the other BRICS nations, they face problems of their own. China is separated from the US via the Pacific Ocean. South Africa is in a similar situation, only it needs to navigate the Atlantic. As for India, its position in the middle of China and South Africa means that it could divide.
I could ride along with you guys. That's what I'm thinking. That's what they're going to have to do. That's why I'm like, Brazil, to be able to do a lot of this stuff, is going to need massive naval support from BRICS. So they'd have to coordinate like that first.
Its forces to attack via either ocean, though it still faces the same problems of getting into the US in the first place. So BRICS has a clear manpower advantage. However, it faces a ton of problems in utilizing that manpower in its US invasion.
Remember, war at this point, I mean, it's been for a while. It all comes down to logistics. To logistically get that 10 million people to land on the shores of the USA, that's going to be so insanely, that is going to be the most difficult task we've ever done in military history. Easily, no question.
And it gets worse for BRICS on that front. Do you remember that we mentioned that the US has 750 military bases in 80 countries? While that reduces US manpower domestically, it also gives America options for attacks closer to BRICS nations. For instance, America has 73 bases in South Korea, 7 in Australia, and 120 in Japan, with the bases combining to contain.
See, I was saying about that. Japan has a lot of it. A lot of that stems from still the Cold War days. We stationed a bunch of troops, a bunch of Americans in Bavaria specifically, but all throughout Western Germany and then Japan too, because that was like kind of the two front lines of where the Cold War was being fought, at least, you know, in the East and the West there.
Contain over 81,000 troops. That is a strong fighting force that could hold up China and India as they try to attack from the Pacific. At worst for the US.
That is, we kind of adjusted after the Cold War to really set our sights on China, especially now. So yeah, I mean, you got allies in Australia, Japan, South Korea is another big one. I'm assuming BRICS would get North Korea too. That's the funny thing. Like, North Korea would automatically join. Why would they not? Why would they not join the BRICS nations? I mean, that's you do kind of got to throw them in there.
It would still.
And they're a heavily militarized nation. I mean, they're small and they don't have that much population to contribute, but they're just 100% military. Imagine a video game, them putting 100% of their perk points all in military, 0 in every other category, basically.
Force those two BRICS nations to divert their attention away from the American mainland for a while. The same applies to Russia. America has 25 UK bases, 119 in Germany, 44 in Italy, and 4 in Spain. That allows it to create a European front designed to prevent Russia from easily making it to the US via the Atlantic Ocean. Using these bases as diversions would allow the US to focus most of its domestic manpower on Brazil's soldiers, at least during the early stages of the war against BRICS.
I mean, I so far agree with this analysis. I do think the USA could try to at least de facto knock out Brazil. I don't think the US could go in and invade Brazil, but we could do enough things, destroy their military industrial complex, which I'm not 100% what really Brazil's got going on down there. I'm sure they got some things, but Brazil's most of Brazil's like fighting force is to fight, you know, kind of illegal drug traffic that's going on or illegal crime activities that are going on. South America is a pretty stable place. They don't necessarily love what they see out of Venezuela. There's a little bit, you know, Brazil has been successful. They have a successful military history, obviously, fighting Paraguay, for instance, and then Argentina. But the U.S. could potentially find a very isolated Brazil and just kind of do enough to get Brazil to not be able to contribute much to the rest of their allies, the BRICS allies, basically. So that way, BRICS just becomes RICS, in a way. RICS, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That was a stupid joke that I felt like I needed to make.
Brings us to the naval battle. A majority of the confrontation between BRICS and the U.S. will take place in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, with skirmishes in the waters close to Russia and China likely taking place if the U.S. breaks through and attacks. The Indian Ocean might also become a battleground, but that would depend on America's ability to get through the Pacific and bypass China.
Oh man, I'm still waiting for me to get to a point, and I know it's going to happen because the video is a long time, but I'm still waiting to get to a point where I severely disagree with an opinion. I think we'll get there probably at the very end, but again, I want to reiterate what I said earlier. I think I'm going to have a very, very controversial statement to make by the end of this video, but we'll see.
America is in a very good position on the naval front. While it doesn't have the world's largest navy in terms of pure assets, with its 440 vessels putting it in second place, it easily comes out on top in the tonnage front.
Yeah, remember that the U.S., you can have like 1,000 ships, but if the 1,000 ships are like sailboats, you know, or tiny fishermen boats, because I think that's China's strategy. That's a lot of people's strategies. But yeah, these ships here, there's less of them, but they've got a ton of firepower.
America's ships combined to displace over 4,500,000.
Something to keep in mind, though, is that the Navy, this has been a big topic of conversation recently, is that the current Navy setup that the U.S. has might not be the most efficient way of how we would theoretically fight a current-day World War III. Because drones and robotics and AI is going to be so massive when it comes to whenever World War III, if World War III were to start now or tomorrow or a couple years from now, there's just a lot of controversy to say that, like, we don't know if this Navy is ready to fight right here. It could be who knows, because of drone warfare and, like I said, other things like that, more robotics. I mean, we might not even really need a military crew. That, especially when it comes to subs might be entirely robotics in the future, which goes into the topic of the manpower conversation. Like, maybe manpower doesn't make a big difference. That could potentially be the U.S.'s side, but China's experimenting with this stuff a lot. So who knows what kind of technology, some type of secret technology the Chinese might have over there, or the Russians, or even the U.S. for that matter.
500,000 tons of water. Why does that matter? Water displacement indicates the size and power of the ships in a country's navy. It shows us that the U.S. has larger
weight class. There's weight classes in combat sports for a reason, yes.
Ships, which means it can pack more firepower and better defenses into its vessels. Among those ships are 11 aircraft carriers and 9 helicopter carriers, which will prove
the carriers are the most important. We have the most carriers in the world. But again, I mean, this is such an interesting I love looking at, like, going down into, like, the military rabbit hole here on YouTube. Like, we don't know how much drones are going to affect naval warfare in World War III. Drones are going to completely change the game. So imagine just, like, kamikazing these carriers with, like, thousands of drones. Do we have drone defenses up? But yeah, I mean, imagine Japanese World War II strategies, but with just thousands of AI automated, just bam. I mean, literally, there's a lot of talk that says that carriers are pretty much useless nowadays.
Prove vital to the aerial aspect of the war. We'll discuss.
I don't know. I did have a discussion with, like, a military guy recently at, like, a local, like, Memorial Day convention here in California, and yeah, I mean, obviously the U.S. military is doing a whole ton of work on defensive capabilities when it comes to thousands of different drones, but I don't know. I don't know if they got I mean, yeah, I'm sure we have some sort of plan, but when there's, like, thousands of coordinated drones that we currently have access to, that the Chinese can, coordinate all at the same time to just send out. I mean, you would have to have, like, little mini iron domes like Israel has for every single carrier. Maybe we can do that, but for 11 different carriers and 9 different helicopter carriers, and these carriers are not like countries. They're going to be moving around and putting themselves in different positions all around and finding themselves in different weather situations and different oceanic atmospheres, and I don't know.
Later. The U.S. also maintains 81 destroyers, which are massive warships capable of blowing holes in other vessels, along with 26 corvettes. It also has 70 submarines, which America could use to attack BRICS surface vessels and, if need be, launch nuclear warheads at the BRICS nations.
Yeah, it's clear to me that I don't think Infographics show is going to get into the futuristic technologies enough here. And it's hard for any of us to make a really big judgment call on who would win this outright, because we don't know. In an all-out World War III scenario like this, it is going to come down to a lot of, like, advanced secret technology. I mean, that's what the whole Cold War was about, is what kind of, like, secret military races were going on under the surface. Like, both sides were speculating what new technology the other side had, and we need to counteract this because we think they have that, so we need to get this, and it's just going to be a mess, and there's just no way to know exactly what each side has secretly cooked up.
Of course,
and the thing is, China and Russia, they got two different powers that have been probably doing a bunch of secret military stuff. Not that India and South Africa and Brazil don't. They might have some, but really leading the charge is China and Russia, and they're on the same team together. Whereas the U.S. is going to be kind of on their own with whatever advanced technology we might possibly be cooking up in some of our, labs, Area 51 or whatever.
Combined, BRICS nations aren't slouches on the naval warfare front. China's Navy has 754 assets, which is over 300 more than the U.S. brings to the fight.
Yes.
However, the tonnage issues come into play here. China's Navy
They're very
collectively
small.
displaces around 3.1 million tons,
They're very small
which
boats.
translates to it having much smaller vessels than the U.S. China brings 3 aircraft carriers and 4 helicopter carriers to the fight, along with 50 destroyers, 47 frigates, and 72 corvettes. It also has a solid stock of 61 submarines. However,
The subs are going to be good. The subs are going to be pretty nice, but I do think that drones are probably going to take over submarine warfare. I don't know how many we have of those on both sides, but
a fifth of its navy is made up of patrol vessels. Those might be fine for serving as an early warning system on the Chinese coast, but they are not going to do much to stop America's destroyers. Russia also has a large navy containing 400.
I think this would be a lot of interesting of a scenario if it was like reduced to just a small skirmish that took place on like neutral territory, like in Europe or something. Well, maybe not Europe because Russia's pretty close to that. Well, BRICS is all over the world, so it's hard to say. I don't know, like North Africa or the Middle East. Maybe we had like a small skirmish just reduced to just the Middle East because it's so difficult for either side to do a successful naval invasion like D-Day. Like, I just do not see that happening.
19 assets. However, the Russian Navy has an even smaller tonnage than China's, displacing almost 1.4 million tons.
Yeah, the Russian Navy is not great, but they've had about, 75 years plus to really come up with a plan they're in the Cold War, they were thinking about this entirely. They knew that they didn't necessarily have the Navy to compete with the West. So I wouldn't be surprised if they got a couple of tricks up their sleeve to be able to fight the U.S. Navy specifically.
That with China, and you get 4.5 million tons, just enough to match the U.S. Navy. Another 63 submarines, 10 destroyers, and an aircraft carrier.
Russia's always been like an army-first sort of nation, though, so that is going to be their strong suit. They're going to have to get their army to land on the shores of the U.S. to really be able to make use of that. But, yeah, Russia and China, I guess, for that instance. I mean, that's why I think in this category the U.S. is going to still have an arguably more dominant Navy, but
are added to the BRICS forces thanks to Russia. Of course, we can't forget about the other 3 BRICS nations. India's Navy is the 6th largest in the world at 293 assets, and it displaces over 650,000 tons of water. India adds another 2 aircraft carriers and 13 destroyers into the mix. It also has 18 submarines, 18 corvettes, and 14 frigates. Brazil and South Africa haven't invested as heavily into their navies as their BRICS compatriots. South Africa brings just 49 vessels to the fight.
South Africa and Brazil are not going to be able to contribute much. I do think that's why I'm thinking this scenario could be that they get knocked out of the war maybe quickly. Maybe not South Africa, maybe Brazil, but who knows?
Which are patrol ships. However, it does add 3 submarines and 4 frigates to the BRICS numbers. As for Brazil,
not bad. I mean, everything contributes.
Assets, about a third of which are patrol ships.
It all helps.
It adds another 4 submarines along with a helicopter carrier and 6 frigates. Still, it adds up.
Yeah,
Combining
it does.
the naval forces of the BRICS nations leads to the 5 bringing more submarines and smaller warships to the fight. The U.S. still has the advantage on the destroyer front, along with having more aircraft carriers, but the fight would be close. BRICS has the numbers advantage. As Captain Sam J. Tangretti, who's a retired member of the U.S. Navy, points out, research on 28 historical naval wars shows us that 25 of them were won by the side with the larger fleet. It was only when fleet size was roughly equal that the superior technology won the day.
I mean, one example I am thinking of, okay, so like, there's so many different where that is the case. Well, he has got 25 out of 28 examples of the bigger Navy winning. World War II, World War I, the American Civil War, for instance. One example that immediately popped in my head where maybe that wasn't necessarily the case was Napoleon. Maybe overall you could say that Napoleon did lose, but he lost to a whole lot of different nations. Napoleon was blockaded, of course, by the British Navy, but overall he created so much chaos just in continental Europe. The French army was insane. The French, I think, had a bigger navy than Russia, but then they lost over there. So, yeah, anyways, it depends.
The U.S. is at a numbers disadvantage on the naval front, and that is a bad thing for its chances. Still, the numbers disadvantage isn't so massive that the U.S. can't put up an extremely strong fight in the Pacific, Atlantic, and all the smaller seas surrounding the BRICS.
One thing I was going to say is that because BRICS, did BRICS declare this war? I'm thinking they did. That would be a massive advantage to be able to coordinate, to get the Brazilian navies and the Indian navies, like maybe, I don't know, to be able to just coordinate with the nations that are more on an island, quote-unquote island by themselves, sending over Chinese Navy to protect the Brazilian coastline or the Russian Navy to protect the South Africa. But we're going to see a lot of this movement. We're not going to get blindsided. Remember, because the American intelligence are probably going to see like, whoa, what the hell is happening? I think there would be warning signs. I don't think the BRICS nations would be able to catch us with our pants down that far. We won't be completely naked. I don't know why I use that metaphor so much, but we'll see all these navies doing a whole lot of movement around the world before it happens. Look at us predicting the Russian invasion of Ukraine like 3 months before it happened. I mean, that's part of the reason why my channel blew up so much, was just because I was covering why so many different memes and country ball comics and content that was just analyzing like, oh, this Russian-Ukrainian war might actually happen. Then it finally did. All the normies around, the world was like, oh, they got checked in, and they were like, oh my gosh, look, this guy's been reviewing stuff about how this war is going to happen like 3 months before it actually did. So I think U.S. intelligence would probably catch on to what was going to happen. So I'm not sure exactly if there would be too much naval coordination. I don't know how much. It depends.
BRICS nations. Several of its fleets also already operate overseas. For instance, the 7th Fleet, which is the largest of the U.S. Navy's front-deployed fleets, operates up to 70 ships and 150 aircraft at any one time. It operates in the area stretching from the international dateline to the border between India and Pakistan. This area covers the Pacific and Indian Oceans to allow the fleet to put up an immediate defense against China and India.
And to protect our allies, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, the whole South China Sea thing. So we're already kind of right there on their border. I mean, we're kind of already on everyone's borders here, specifically China and Russia and Europe. We're kind of right there ready to go.
That's how the U.S. would use its Navy, defense. Its goal would be to hold back the combined BRICS navies for as long as possible. Its problem would be that it has to divide its forces on 2 fronts. Half the U.S. Navy would fight in the Atlantic, the other half in the Pacific, allowing the BRICS numbers advantage to pay off.
Yes, and we're already at a disadvantage, like he's saying here, number-wise. So that would be a very big deal.
As the war approaches its midpoint. Or it would, but the U.S. has a trump card up its sleeve.
Oh.
The U.S. Air Force. Not only is the U.S. Air Force powerful in its own right, as we'll soon show.
It has one of the biggest... Is it the Navy that also has the 2nd biggest Air Force or some crazy thing like that?
But it regularly works alongside the U.S. Navy to conduct joint operations.
Yeah.
That's why the U.S. has so many aircraft carriers. It'll be bringing plenty of aircraft to a naval fight. Of course, the BRICS nations have that option too, thanks to their aircraft carriers that China and India maintain. However, they may run into cooperation issues with their lack of direct combat experience, making it difficult to make full.
That is a key component. I'm liking this direction to go down. Can BRICS work enough together? Maybe they've got to really have like some passionate hatred for the USA. The problem is that India and China really do not like each other, and those 2 powers really got to coordinate a lot. Maybe the war starts where BRICS attacks the USA, but how long until a lot of internal fighting that happens between India and China, like I said, or even Russia and China? I mean, the relationship that Russia and China have together, there's a little bit of a... Russia just feels a little worried about China. That's the thing. That's like this, where the Chinese border Russia, that's kind of their weak side. They get a little bit worried, especially because of how much smaller Russia is compared to China. I'm not talking about land area, obviously. I'm talking about purely population and things like that. Would they be able to work together enough? How long before these nations, specifically Russia, India, and China, begin to fight just amongst each other? That could be a huge advantage the U.S. has if they can intentionally cause those 3 powers to begin to fight behind closed doors.
Full use of their naval-based aerial forces. The U.S. could take advantage of those problems by using its aircraft carriers to decimate BRICS vessels via its fighters and helicopters. That brings us to the aerial forces each combatant brings to the war. The U.S., as is the case in so many other areas of warfare, is easily the strongest nation when it comes to aerial might.
Yeah.
The U.S. military has over 13,000 aircraft, which is the most out of any nation in the world. It also comes out on top in the fighters category with close to...
Important to note, though, let's look at the Vietnam War. Air superiority does not win wars. How many times has America had to learn that lesson? In Afghanistan, in Vietnam, that does not win wars. You need to be able to have the boots on the ground. You absolutely have to have boots on the ground. So maybe we can, cause... It can be annoying, and we can cause a lot of damage, but it's not enough to just have the skies dominated by you.
The 1800 and 900 attack-type aircraft. America is the world leader in every major category of aircraft. It has 918 fixed-wing transports, over 2,600 trainers, 647 special mission craft, and nearly 7,000 helicopters and attack choppers. But the potential difference maker in the U.S. arsenal is its fleet of aerial tankers. These aircraft...
I wish we talked about drones, but I know we're not going to. But that's going to obviously lead to a pretty big part of it. I mean, yeah.
will prove just as vital to the naval aspect of the battle as the aerial side of it. A tanker is an aircraft that provides aerial refueling capabilities to other aircraft. In practice...
First of all, let me just mention, because I don't know if there's... I didn't get to say this. There is absolutely 0% chance the U.S. successfully invades these BRIC nations and occupies them. There's a 0% chance. The U.S. will not be doing that. We're just seeing if the USA can protect their own sovereignty. That's really the only question here. Will the U.S. be able to protect their shores? Because there's no way the U.S. outright wins this war and just walks into these countries' lands. No way.
That means the U.S. can keep its fighters and attack-type craft in the air longer than the BRICS nations, allowing them to cause more damage. The jewel in the American tanker fleet is the KC-135 Stratotanker, capable of reaching speeds of up to 530 miles per hour while flying at 30,000 feet. The tanker has a 1,500-mile range while carrying 150,000 pounds of fuel. For context, America's F-35A planes have an internal fuel capacity of almost 18,500 pounds. That means a single KC-135 can refuel an F-35A 8 times before the tanker has to be grounded.
Dang.
America would take advantage of its global military presence to send its tankers into the skies. Tankers could take off from Japan to circle the seas surrounding China. Those tankers would stay out of range of the enemy's aerial defenses and likely have American fighters and drones defending them from BRICS aerial assaults. For as long as those tankers stay in the skies, they serve as refueling points for America's other aircraft. The U.S. could send F-35s from one of its aircraft carriers to bombard China's ships with missiles. Tankers also make long-distance assaults possible. If the U.S. wants to...
Whoa. What is up with that? What is up with that map of China? I didn't get this memo when China started annexing Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Okay, it's a little strange.
To attack key military targets.
Man, I thought this video is doing pretty good so far. This is the only mistake I've seen so far, but yes. But we'll see also if we make some mention to some of the things I also mentioned: drone warfare, futuristic technologies, secrets, nukes, things like that. There's still a lot to cover here that we're missing, but we're only halfway through this video.
Nations, its tankers essentially extend the range of its bombers and fighter jets so they can reach countries that are thousands of miles away. Of course, the BRICS nations combine to present an air force that represents a sturdy challenge to the U.S. China has a fleet of 3,300 aircraft, which includes 371 attack types and 1,200 fighter jets. However, it only has 10 tankers. Similarly, Russia has a large air force of 4,300 aircraft, which includes 833 fighters and 689 attack types. However, it also has only 19 tankers, and almost half of its air assets are helicopters that won't be of much use unless the BRICS nations manage to reach American soil. India adds another 2,200 aircraft to the BRICS Air Force, with 513 of them being fighters, along with 130 attack types.
Something I'm keeping in mind is that this is a lot of land area that the Russians, Chinese, and Indians specifically are going to have to protect, because now they're on one side, and that is, first of all, you have the first biggest country in the world in terms of land area, Russia. China is number 3 or 4, just right next to the USA. The USA and China are essentially the same exact size. And then India. This is a lot of contiguous territory now that they're going to have to protect, and they won't have necessarily the sky dominance. So America could cause a lot of annoyances by, bombing certain facilities, causing havoc back behind, way back behind the shores and things like that.
But again, close to half of India's air force is choppers, and it only has 6 tankers. South Africa is almost a non-factor. 97 of its 182 aircraft are helicopters, with another 81 of its crafts being
2 fighters?
trainers.
South Africa only has 2 fighters? That's crazy.
Bringing 2 fighters and 12 fixed transports won't contribute much to the BRICS aerial assault.
Yeah.
Brazil fares a little better with 513 aerial assets.
That's what I'm saying. I think in a certain scenario, maybe things play out where Brazil just straight up, the U.S. just straight up knocks out Brazil and South Africa. I mean, you could do things to really make them not be able to contribute much at all. You wipe out their Navy, you wipe out their Air Force. I mean, what are they going to do with their army if they can't even get to your shores? You wipe out their Navy and their Air Force, and yeah, they're really not going to be able to do much at all. Obviously, the big thing is, though, the big contributing members would be Russia, India, China. You're not removing much by getting rid of Brazil and South Africa, but still.
Including 43 fighters and 38 attack types, it could also attempt to use its 109 fixed-wing transports to fly troops into the U.S. However, it also brings no tankers to the fight. That tanker usage is the potential difference maker for the United States.
Potentially?
BRICS only has 35 tankers compared to more than 600 available
Whoa!
to the U.S. Air Force.
Okay.
Perhaps that disparity opens up some strategic opportunities for the U.S. on the naval and aerial fronts. America could use its submarines to attack the BRICS aircraft carriers, limiting BRICS' ability to attack American ships with fighters and bombers. It could also take advantage of the range disadvantage created by BRICS having access to so few tankers. Taking even some of those 35 refueling planes out of the sky limits the range of the BRICS aerial forces to the seas surrounding their countries. That would mean a very limited number of BRICS aircraft making it to the U.S. On the naval front, the U.S. could deploy its aircraft carriers, each with a...
I mean, if we lose the naval battle, it doesn't matter. If we lose the naval battle, then they will be able to get to American front, homeland, but they'd have to lose that first.
Flotilla of destroyers to the seas around the BRICS nations. The U.S. would likely deploy multiple carrier strike groups to key strategic locations, a couple in the North Atlantic, the Western Pacific, and the Indian Ocean, with additional carriers in the Atlantic to counter Brazil and South Africa. Each of those...
We'd be losing so many ships and so many aircrafts, though. I mean, maybe we'd be successful at hitting strategic targets, but the losses. And the other scary thing is, in World War II, the big reason why the U.S. was so powerful was just the manufacturing. Our manufacturing level was just insane, and no one could hit it. The Germans couldn't get to it to destroy factories. But we don't make things anymore. And that's a big topic that Trump talks about. Would we be able to, first of all, would we even be able to start producing things here in the U.S. again? And how long would it take? That's the big thing. You got to turn the economy into like a military-based economy. Russia was able to do it, but Russia had a little bit more. Russia was able to do it as of recently against Ukraine, but Russia had more of an advantage. They was always leaning towards that. They didn't have a long way to go. The U.S. would have a lot further way to go back to the old like manufacturing levels of military equipment like we did in World War II. I don't know if it could be done. So we'd be hitting things, yes. But we'd be losing a lot of material, not only the men, but a lot of material at the same time. How fast would we be able to pump out new aircraft, new Navy? That would be the question. And would we be able to pump it out faster than we'd be losing it? We have, I think maybe a slight military advantage, but how fast does that drain? And how fast until we can kind of shift our economy into that military-based economy to be able to reproduce all the things we're losing?
Those carriers would be positioned beyond the reach of BRICS nations' fighters, attack aircraft, and anti-ship ballistic missiles, which have a striking range of up to 2,500 miles. Those carriers enable aerial bombardments of BRICS vessels, with American tanker fleets ensuring that the country's aircraft can stay in the skies for longer. The U.S. would also have to blockade entry into Brazil to prevent the rest of the BRICS nations from transporting troops into that country that could then move north and attack the U.S. from the south. Same goes for the Bering Strait. The U.S. can't afford to allow Russia access to the mainland via that narrow water passage. Still, it might be able to manage it by combining its naval and aerial assets.
I think most of, it'd be spread out. That Atlantic fleet would be pretty spread out because you got to watch Europe because of Russia, but then you have to bring down some to, like I said, like he just mentioned, blockading Brazil. And then the Pacific is actually the scariest. You probably need the most amount of ships and air force over there.
That's the power of America's combined approach to warfare. It's not just bringing its ships to a naval fight, it's also bringing powerful aircraft. And when you supplement all of this with the global military bases we mentioned earlier, the US gives itself plenty of options for attack while still being able to defend.
Power in numbers is what old Uncle Sam always says. Is that a reference to the Middle East, Desert Storm? What is
and
that?
some of its most valuable naval assets.
Like he looks like Saddam or something. I don't know.
It would also force the BRICS nations to use their air forces to guard their own territory, rather than attack the American mainland. For some of those nations, notably Brazil and South Africa, that could be a warfare death sentence as they're hit constantly with American missiles and bombs until they're forced to pull out of the fight. Let's say that BRICS manages to break through the combined naval and aerial blockade. It finds a route into the US mainland via the Atlantic or Pacific, with the countries working together to transport troops via that route to bring a ground war to the US. We already know BRICS comes out on top in terms of pure manpower, though even with this naval route opened, it would still face a challenge of getting that manpower onto the American mainland.
Yes.
But what about the ground equipment front? The US is no slouch.
Ooh, tanks. We will not have enough tanks, but also quality of tank makes a very big difference. But then again, also quantity. But Russia, I think, has the most tanks in the world, depending on some estimates. Oh, you know, that Russia actually might be lower now because of the war in Ukraine. Do we have new numbers on how many tanks they might have lost? They're also producing more tanks, so this number is constantly fluctuating.
In that department,
North Korea has a lot of tanks too.
Maintains a stockpile of 4,600 tanks, which is the third most in the world. However, it's on the military vehicle front that America truly excels. It has 392,000 vehicles, which include everything from armored fighting vehicles to personnel carriers that it could deploy into its territory at will. That gives the US a major logistical advantage if the war with BRICS arrives on the American mainland. The US falls a little behind on the artillery front, with 671 self-propelled units and 1,200 towed artillery units. But again, it's BRICS that is invading the US, and that means the BRICS nations.
Yeah, that's important to reiterate. The artillery front could be a problem for the US military bases all around the world. But I don't know how you're going to be able to land that artillery, get it set. I mean, first do a successful naval invasion, then maybe the artillery would make a difference inside of, you know, American homeland.
Also have to find ways to transport their artillery into the US. The US also has 641 multiple launch rocket systems, or MLRS, to bring to the fight. Combine all of that ground equipment with the US Air Force assets that aren't taking part in the naval battle, a standing army of around 1 million, and the potential for mobilization of an already well-armed American population, and BRICS faces a difficult nut to crack. But it's not an impossible fight. China's land forces include 6,800 tanks and 144,000 military vehicles. It also brings 4,500 self-propelled and towed artillery to the battle, along with...
I think this situation becomes a whole lot more interesting if you introduce Mexico to the fight. If you let BRICS plus Mexico... Did I say Brixico? Yeah, Brixico, basically. BRICS plus Mexico would be interesting because then you have that bordering nation where, you know, BRICS allies could race towards and then stay safe. And another advantage that Mexico would have is all that rough terrain. It would not be fun to fight in all the mountainous Mexican hills, and you could hide a whole lot of stuff there. A lot of their organized crime does hide a lot of stuff there. So that could be an advantage that China could hide a bunch of military stuff, and Russia, and even if the Americans come in and invade Mexico really quick, that could be our downfall. Look at the way Napoleon they struggled immensely in Spain. Spain in the early 1800s was France's Vietnam or France's Afghanistan. The French did occupy Spain and Iberia, but there was so much heavy fighting back there. Meanwhile, France had to dedicate resources all around everywhere else. That could very easily become, if the U.S. is Napoleonic France, then Mexico would be our Spain. And that's kind of funny because Mexico and Spain obviously have a shared history and things like that.
Almost 2,800 MLRS. Russia posts similar numbers. It has close to 5,800 tanks. Russia's also lost over 21,000 armored fighting vehicles in the fight with Ukraine, though it still has 132,000 left over. Add over 13,500 artillery units and around 3,000 MLRS to those numbers.
Does that Russian have a hammer and sickle again on his beret there? Is that, I don't know. Are they going back to being communist? They're allied to China, so maybe they want to be communists again now.
And there's a clear advantage forming for BRICS in every aspect of the land power front other than military vehicles. India extends that advantage so it covers vehicles, as it adds another 149,000 to the mix, along with around 4,200 tanks. Its nearly 4,000 units of towed artillery could also be useful. South Africa and Brazil bring up the rear again, though they still contribute. South Africa has 18,700.
Again, there's no doubt the BRICS side is going to have the numerical advantage on pretty much everything. Even if one of the categories or one or two or three of the categories America has a slight advantage, overall the numbers are going to be completely on BRICS' side. The only advantage the U.S. has is that this is a defensive war for them, which is key, which makes the conversation very interesting.
100 military vehicles and 252 tanks to add to the BRICS numbers, though it is limited to less than 300 units on the artillery and MLRS fronts. Brazil posts similar, though slightly higher numbers. It has 22,500 vehicles, 294 tanks, 412 units of towed artillery, 109 units of self-propelled artillery, and 38 MLRS systems. They're far from groundbreaking numbers, but Brazil's proximity to the U.S. could make them useful if Mexico allows Brazil to pass through. But therein lies the problem on the land front: proximity. The BRICS nations have to find ways to ship all of this equipment into the United States. Even if BRICS manages to secure a naval passage into the U.S., it'll have done so at a massive cost.
Oh yeah, they're gonna lose a lot of stuff. Maybe drone submarines that ship cargo. Maybe. I mean, I'm sure that's being discussed right now. They're probably way beyond that at this point, Drew, because people that like this is their job to just study military logistics, they're probably on some crazy nanotechnology of how they're going to, move cargo all the way around the world.
Hundreds of ships will be sunk, along with hundreds of aircraft being shot out of the skies. And even with that passage
on both sides, to be fair,
BRICS can't send everything into the U.S. at once. It would have to send its land equipment in drips and drabs, forcing long pauses to the war as BRICS replenishes stockpiles in areas of the U.S. it captured.
That
would give the U.S. time to manufacture more weapons, which brings us to the next issue in the BRICS versus U.S. war.
The economy.
The U.S. spends more on its military than any other nation in the world.
I like that we put this part at the very end, but I think that, we discussed this in the very beginning. This is probably the first thing that comes to mind when people discuss a U.S. versus anything, any sort of possible World War III scenario. The first thing that comes up is U.S. military spending.
Its proposed budget for the 2025 financial year is $850 billion, with that annual budget likely to rise to $866 billion adjusted for inflation by 2029. The U.S. also has an interesting advantage in that most of its military equipment is designed and produced domestically. The likes of Lockheed Martin, RTX Corporation, Boeing, and General Dynamics are massive contributors to the U.S. defense industry. Even corporations like BAE Systems, which is based in the UK, have U.S. production lines that could keep running during the battle against BRICS. America's tactics would be simple: keep pumping all of that money into weapons production while ensuring its manufacturing facilities are well defended.
And we're assuming BRICS gets an ally. I feel like we have to assume the U.S. would find a way to get an ally. I mean, it's only fair, right? It's possible that they don't. Because, like I said, they're making a lot of people mad. But I would assume the U.S. would not be going at this alone, especially for people in Asia that just don't like China, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines. There'd be people, obviously we'd have a Ukrainian ally. We'd obviously there's plenty of people that are going to despise one of 5 of these countries a lot more than they despise the USA. It's inevitable, just because there's not that many nations that neighbor. We only have 2 neighbors, Canada and Mexico. That's it.
Against the incoming BRICS military. That's another advantage that the extended naval and aerial battles bring to the U.S. Taking out as many BRICS ships and aircrafts as possible limits BRICS' ability to launch missiles and similar aerial strikes against America's weapons production. Of course, the BRICS nations have a large military budget as well.
I'm liking this animation, this kind of drawing of the Russian and Chinese borders. This is really cool.
Again, the heavy hitters are China and Russia. China announced a 7.2% increase in its military budget in 2024, bringing its spending to $236.1 billion per year. In 2024, Russia's military budget was $129 billion. India has also announced a massive budget increase for the 2025 financial year. It will up its spending by 9.5% to $78.4 billion. Brazil adds another $23.7 billion into the mix.
It's not bad, but like I said in the very beginning, Russia loves spending on their military. I mean, they're spending a lot right now because of Ukraine, but it is something to keep in mind because Russia is fighting and they're kind of bogged down in Ukraine. I don't know. it'd be very interesting to see what happens with the Ukrainian war if the Russians, for whatever reason, was now focused on fighting the USA. Would they be able to contribute that much? They would definitely be lessening the Ukrainian front, maybe giving the Ukrainians an advantage. Even if the Europeans don't ally to the U.S., the Europeans have a very strategic advantage to support Ukraine. I mean, they're the number one, they're clearly bigger supporters of Ukraine than even the U.S. is. So I could definitely see a situation where the Europeans start really heavily pushing to prop up Ukraine and maybe making Ukraine more powerful, while the Russians have kind of their sights set now in the Pacific Ocean and the USA. Maybe the Ukrainians would be able to do more excursions inside of Russian territory. It could be a mess.
Its budget goes toward maintaining its military personnel rather than building.
You don't necessarily need countries to ally to the USA. You just need countries to launch their own little problems, their own little side missions, I guess, against any one of these 5 BRIC nations.
Its equipment stocks. Then there's South Africa, and while the other BRICS nations are spending as heavily as they can, South Africa goes in the opposite direction. Its 2024 to 2025 defense budget was just a tiny 0.7% of the country's gross domestic product, or GDP. Given that its GDP was $380.7 billion in 2023, some quick math tells us that the country spent about $2.66 billion on defense in 2024. That is well below even the $3 billion it spent in 2022, which was also an 11.
Again, I know that BRICS is such a popular topic because everyone in the West gets freaked out about the idea of BRICS, but this is just not a thing. Like, it's not a military thing. It's not an alliance. It's just people that are protesting, like he said in the very beginning, like the West's kind of dominance and things like, but them all coming together is just really, really hard to see.
74% decline on the previous year.
It's just people being like, hey, I object to, hey, like we should probably like try other things, like allow other de facto world powers and currencies and UN votes and things like that.
In essence, South Africa is almost a non-contributor on the budget front. Combine the 5 BRICS nations and you get a total budget of almost $470 billion, just over half of what the U.S. spends on defense.
That's crazy.
That could be a massive difference maker.
That is crazy.
As the naval war of attrition takes hold. As the BRICS nations suffer losses in aircraft, ships, and personnel, they'll face a critical challenge, replenishing their stockpiles. The U.S. military, with its vast budget and domestic manufacturing capacity, can replace losses far more efficiently than its adversaries. While Russia and China are major weapons producers, they'll be crippled by disrupted trade routes due to relentless naval battles. The two could trade resources, with Russia's iron ore and China's rare earth minerals supporting their war industries, but without matching America's defense spending, they'll struggle to sustain their war effort. Or they would if it weren't for one factor. BRICS and the U.S. don't spend their money in the same way. As the Center for Economic Policy Research, or CEPR, points out, the flat budgets we've already mentioned only indicate what BRICS nations would procure if they spent their money in the United States. They don't do that. A more accurate measure comes from purchasing power parity, or PPP. According to CEPR, PPP factors in local manufacturing and troop costs, which are lower among the BRICS nations than they are in the U.S.
I thought China was number 1 with a PPP. Are we talking, maybe it's by a different definition?
This metric, China spends the equivalent of $541 billion on its military in 2024. More than double the dollar amount, assuming the country spent the money in the U.S. What it all comes down to is that production is cheaper for BRICS nations than it is for the U.S. Though America spends more in terms of pure dollar
kind of what
amount,
I was saying.
Adjusting for PPP may just put BRICS ahead, especially if all 5 nations funnel their money into China to take advantage of the lower costs.
True.
There's one final factor to consider in the war.
That's the scary thing, is China is the world's manufacturer. So yeah, Russia and India, Brazil, South Africa, they could just give them all the resources, all the money, have China just become this massive manufacturing hub for this military thing. And yeah, okay, we're going to finally get into the new conversation.
Between the U.S. and BRICS, nuclear weapons, and both sides have a lot of them. The U.S. brings 5,200 nuclear weapons to the table. That's enough to destroy all the BRICS nations. However, BRICS can hit right back on the nuclear front. Russia has 5,600 nukes.
More.
China has around 600. India even contributes with 172 nuclear weapons. If the war got to the point where
it's mostly a Russia versus U.S. thing, but yeah, China makes it a little bit more of an advantage for the BRICS side.
Each side was willing to push the big red button, there would only be one outcome: mutual destruction. Assuming it doesn't get to that point, the outcome of the war between the US and BRICS would hinge on a naval battle. BRICS brings more ships to the front. However, the US has bigger and more powerful ships, along with integration with its air force that could help it cause havoc on the BRICS Navy. If the BRICS forces were magically transported to the US all at once, they would grind out a victory on American soil. But that's not what would happen. With a smart naval and aerial strategy, the US might just be able to stop BRICS from ever mounting a serious land assault on American soil. Given how devastating the war would be to both sides, that's about as close to a victory as either is going to get. Who do you think would come out on top in a full-scale war between the US and BRICS? Would America's military dominance and industrial power be enough, or could BRICS leverage its massive manpower and resources to change the global order? Drop your thoughts below. Now go check out US plan if China takes Taiwan.
Yeah, basically, all right, controversial statement time that I've been waiting to tell for the whole video. This is going to come down to basically a stalemate. This is just going to be a stalemate. No one's going to even if BRICS wins the inevitable, massive naval battle that takes place, which is very possible, I just don't see how they're supposed to just do this, like literally D-Day times 1,000. Like, it's just going to be so much more complicated. Most of India, China, and Russia's resources, D-Day invasion, but across the globe, which again is why so much of World War II alternative history is a little bit ridiculous, like the man in the high castle situation, just because even to this day in 2025, it's hard to imagine a nation like China successfully navally invading the USA all across the world. Like back in 1944, this would be very difficult as well. The thing that makes it different is the amount of nukes. I'm assuming that nukes are not going to be occurred in this situation, not going to occur. Nukes could play a pretty interesting factor, but, I feel like we try to not use nukes, which is why I think it ultimately come down to just kind of a stalemate. Again, I think this scenario would be a lot more interesting if we play it on a neutral playing field, a neutral game day stadium. Let's have this fight play out in the Middle East. That would be really fascinating, because then you'd have both sides racing to get resources to this, neutral location somewhere in the Middle East. Maybe in Israel, who knows? If that would be a fascinating scenario, and that kind of brings it into, I don't know, a lot more. I feel like more discussion could be had here. But let me know down below in the comment section down below what you think. Don't forget to check out the link to makeshift.com if you want an Irish or Scottish ball. Ireland is dead right now. He's on my floor. But yeah, see you next time. Big old thanks to my patrons over at Patreon. Who out here calling bro a history expert? Tambre, Drew's Argentinian Trust Fund, NordTyrol, Nolan, Miglu the Goat, LuxembourgLover, KirinoIsBestGirl, KingBearHaze, Fredrik Tibblin, DOOCHBAGGINS, Pavlik, Carmel Saida, AlexandertheTerrible. If you'd like your name here, check out that link in the description down below to patreon.com.